I'd lived in the building for 3 months before I noticed the elevator. It wasn't exactly hidden, but it might as well have been, tucked away at the end of a poorly lit corridor on the ground floor. The building was old, a relic of the 1920s, with creaking pipes and walls that seemed to whisper when the wind picked up. The elevator fit right in, an ornate, wrought iron cage with a brass panel of buttons, each dulled by years of use. Or disuse, I thought. A sign hung crookedly on the gate, out of service. The elevator doors never opened, and no one in the building ever mentioned it. I assumed it had been out of commission for decades. But then I overheard Mrs. Calloway, the elderly woman from the 3rd floor, whispering about it to her grandson. "It's not out of service," she said, her voice low and urgent. "It just doesn't work during the day." The boy, no older than 10, asked why. Mrs. Calloway's response was immediate, almost fearful. "You don't want to know, and you'll never use it. Promise me." That night, her words played over in my mind. Why would an elevator only work at night? And why was she so adamant about avoiding it? I tried to shake it off as superstition, the ramblings of an old woman clinging to stories from her youth. But the thought nagged at me, especially when I passed the elevator on my way up the stairs. Something about it felt wrong, like it was waiting for someone, or something. The mystery festered until I couldn't ignore it. One evening, as I was heading back to my apartment, I noticed something new. A folded piece of paper had been wedged into the gate, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. Curious, I pulled it free and unfolded it. The edges were frayed and the ink was smudged, but the words were clear. Rules for the elevator. Only use the elevator between 12 a.m. and 12 a.m. Press the button for the 6th floor first, no matter where you're going. Do not speak during the ride, no matter what you hear. If anyone enters the elevator, do not look directly at them. Never ride the elevator twice in one night. At the bottom of the page, written in a shaky hand, was a final warning. Follow the rules or don't ride at all. I stared at the list, a cold knot forming in my stomach. It had to be a joke. Someone in the building was messing with me, or maybe the note was meant for someone else. But as I stood there, reading and rereading the rules, I felt something shift. The air around the elevator seemed heavier, the shadows deeper. I stuffed the paper in my pocket and walked away, telling myself I wouldn't give it another thought. But as midnight approached, I found myself standing in front of the elevator, staring at its ornate gate. The out-of-service sign swung gently, as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. I glanced at my watch, 11:59 p.m. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was stupidity. Either way, I pushed open the gate and stepped inside. The elevator smelled of oil and metal, a sharp contrast to the faint mildew scent that clung to the rest of the building. Inside, it was cramped, with a brass panel of worn buttons numbered from 1 to 10. A small dim bulb hung from the ceiling, casting flickering light that barely reached the corners of the cab. I felt the faint hum of machinery beneath my feet, an odd sensation for something supposedly broken. The out-of-service sign swayed behind the gate, almost mocking me as I stood there. I glanced at my watch. 12 a.m. on the dot. My fingers hovered over the buttons, hesitating for a moment. The rules echoed in my mind. Press the button for the 6th floor first, no matter where you're going. Ridiculous, I muttered under my breath, but I followed the instructions anyway. The button clicked softly under my touch, and the elevator jolted to life. The sensation was smoother than I expected, almost unnervingly so. The cab rose steadily, the floor numbers lighting up one by one. A mechanical whir accompanied the motion, growing louder as the elevator climbed. When it stopped at the 6th floor, the light flickered violently, and the doors didn't open. My stomach churned as a soft ding echoed through the cab. I stared at the closed doors, waiting. The building was silent, unnervingly so, and the air inside the elevator felt too still. I pressed the button for my own floor, 8, and the cab resumed its ascent without another hitch. When the doors opened, I stepped out cautiously, half expecting something unusual. The hallway looked the same as ever, dim, quiet, lined with peeling wallpaper and faintly flickering sconces. I shook my head, trying to laugh off the tension. Maybe the note had just been an elaborate prank, or maybe the building's ancient wiring gave the elevator some quirks. Either way, I was fine. But the oddities didn't stop there. As I turned toward my apartment, I froze. At the far end of the hallway, where the faint light barely reached, stood a figure. It was tall and unmoving, its outline blurred by the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as I stared, trying to make out details, but it remained featureless, just a dark silhouette against the dim backdrop. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move, didn't acknowledge me in any way, but as I blinked, it was gone. 1 second there, the next it had melted into the shadows like it had never been there at all. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling, and rushed inside my apartment. I locked the door behind me, leaning against it as I tried to catch my breath. My heart was pounding, and my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. The rest of the night passed in uneasy silence. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the rules from the note replaying in my head. By morning, I had convinced myself it was nothing, a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. But the feeling lingered. The elevator had worked perfectly, despite being out of service. And that figure, whatever it was, had been real. I told myself I wouldn't use the elevator again, not at midnight, not ever. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. The next few nights, I avoided the elevator completely. I stuck to the stairs, even when my legs ached from long days at work. I didn't want to think about the note, the rules, or the figure I'd seen in the hallway. But no matter how much I tried to push it out of my mind, the elevator seemed to haunt me. Each time I passed it, I felt its presence, like it was waiting. By the 5th night, curiosity got the better of me. It wasn't just the elevator, it was the rules. Who had written them? Why did they exist? And what would really happen if I broke them? The note hadn't explained, and part of me wondered if the entire thing was just a strange coincidence. At 11:55 p.m., I stood in front of the elevator again, my hands clammy and my heart pounding. This time, the out-of-service sign seemed to sway more than usual, as if it were urging me forward. I hesitated, then stepped inside, the faint hum of machinery greeting me like an old friend. The note was in my pocket, and I unfolded it, rereading the rules by the dim light of the elevator bulb. I thought about each one carefully, but my focus landed on Rule 3. Do not speak during the ride, no matter what you hear. It was absurd. Why would speaking matter? And what could I possibly hear in an empty elevator? I glanced at my watch. Midnight. With a deep breath, I pressed the button for the 6th floor, following the rules just as I had before. The elevator jolted to life, its ascent smooth and quiet. The doors didn't open when we reached the 6th floor, just like before. But this time, I didn't press my floor. Instead, I waited. The seconds ticked by, each one louder than the last in the silence of the cab. The air felt heavier, pressing against my chest, and then I heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft, I almost thought I'd imagined it. But it came again, clearer this time. A voice, low and insistent, murmuring words I couldn't understand. My pulse quickened, and my throat tightened. Ignore it, I thought. Follow the rules. But the whisper grew louder, becoming a chant that echoed off the walls of the cab. My hands clenched into fists, and before I could stop myself, I spoke. "Who's there?" The chanting stopped immediately, replaced by silence so complete it was suffocating. My ears rang with the absence of sound, and the air in the elevator seemed to shift. The light flickered, and the cab shuddered as though something had grabbed hold of it. Then, the elevator began to descend. I hadn't pressed a button, but the cab moved steadily downward, faster than before. The panel of buttons was dark, and the numbers didn't light up as we passed each floor. My breath came in short gasps as I gripped the handrail, the sensation of falling making my stomach churn. The elevator stopped abruptly, and the doors opened to reveal nothing but darkness. Not a hallway, not another floor, just an empty void that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. "Step out," a voice whispered, echoing from the shadows. It wasn't the same voice as before. This one was sharper, colder, and it sent a chill through my entire body. I stayed frozen, unable to move or even breathe. The void seemed to pulse, like it was alive, and the voice came again, louder this time. "Step out." "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. The cab shuddered violently, and the doors began to close. As they did, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. A figure, tall and thin, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long. Its face was featureless, but I felt its gaze on me, heavy and all-consuming. The doors slammed shut, and the elevator shot upward. My legs nearly gave out as the cab ascended, faster than before, the walls creaking with the strain. I gripped the rail tightly, my heart pounding as I watched the panel. When it finally stopped, the doors opened to the 8th floor. I stumbled out, collapsing against the wall of the hallway. Everything was quiet again, but my body shook with adrenaline. I glanced back at the elevator, its ornate gate standing as still as ever, the out-of-service sign swinging gently. I knew I had broken the rules, and whatever was in that void knew it too. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and unease. Every creak of the old building felt amplified, every shadow in the hallway sharper and darker. I avoided the elevator completely, taking the stairs even when my legs ached. But the memory of the void and the figure within it haunted me, playing over and over in my mind. I needed answers. The residents of the building were no help. Most of them either dismissed my questions or claimed ignorance. Mrs. Calloway, who had first piqued my curiosity, avoided me altogether, her grandson trailing behind her like a shadow. A few neighbors exchanged wary glances when I mentioned the elevator, but no one offered anything useful. Desperation drove me to the building's basement, a musty storage area lined with rusting pipes and forgotten junk. There, in a locked cabinet covered in cobwebs, I found what I was looking for, a stack of old blueprints and maintenance logs. The blueprints were faded but legible, detailing the original construction of the building in the 1920s. The elevator was marked clearly, its shaft extending through all 10 floors. But there was something unusual, a section beneath the basement labeled Sublevel 1. There was no stair access, no entrance, just a void marked with the same dimensions as the elevator cab. The maintenance logs were even stranger. They were filled with cryptic notes about unusual repairs and unexplained malfunctions. One entry, dated 1975, stood out. Elevator operational only between 12 a.m. and 12:05 a.m. Mechanism intact. Unusual energy readings detected at sublevel 1. Advised not to investigate further. Rules posted for safety. Another entry, from 1988, chilled me to the core. Incident reported. Tenant failed to follow rules. Elevator returned empty, but sublevel 1 shows activity. Maintenance staff refused to investigate. Tenant presumed lost. Lost. The word echoed in my mind, heavy with implication. Whatever the elevator connected to, It wasn't part of this world. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were a fragile line between safety and something far worse. I found more clues in the dusty records. There were reports of people disappearing over the decades, tenants who used the elevator improperly or too frequently. Some were never seen again. Others were found wandering the halls, muttering incoherently, their minds fractured by whatever they'd encountered. One name appeared multiple times: Daniel Warren. He was listed as the first building manager and the person responsible for drafting the rules. There were no personal records about him, but his final note, scribbled hastily on the back of a maintenance report, stopped me cold. The elevator isn't ours. It never was. Follow the rules, or it will take you. I don't know where, but it won't bring you back. The weight of the discovery pressed down on me. I wasn't just dealing with a malfunctioning elevator or some quirky superstition. This was something ancient, something wrong, hiding in plain sight, and I had broken the rules. That night, I locked my door and pushed my desk against it, as if that could keep the building's secrets at bay. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the elevator called me back. The night air felt heavier than usual, pressing against the walls of the building like a storm was brewing, though the sky outside was eerily clear. Midnight approached, and I found myself standing outside the elevator again, heart pounding, the crumpled rules in my pocket. Every part of me screamed to walk away, to climb the stairs, to forget this place and its impossible demands. But I couldn't, not after what I'd read, not after what I'd seen. The gate creaked as I opened it, the sound echoing through the empty corridor. The air inside the elevator was colder than I remembered, almost biting. I stepped in, the list of rules clutched tightly in my hand, and pressed the button for the 6th floor. The cab shuddered, then began its ascent. The usual hum of machinery seemed distorted, lower, almost guttural. The panel's light flickered, and the cab jolted violently, nearly knocking me off my feet. When it stopped at the 6th floor, the doors didn't open. Instead, the chanting began. It was faint at first, just like before, a soft murmur that grew louder with each passing second. My pulse quickened, and I clenched my fists, determined not to speak this time. The rules were clear. Do not speak during the ride, no matter what you hear. But the voices didn't stop. They grew more insistent, overlapping until they were no longer voices, but a cacophony of sound that seemed to press against my skull. My vision blurred, and the elevator jolted again, plummeting downward so fast I felt weightless. The descent stopped abruptly, the force throwing me against the wall. The doors slid open, revealing the same void I had seen before, an endless darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolence. But this time, the void wasn't empty. The figure was waiting for me, standing motionless just beyond the threshold. It was clearer now, its elongated limbs bending at unnatural angles, its head tilted as if observing me. Its face, or the lack of one, was a void within the void, an absence so profound it hurt to look at. "You've broken the rules," it said, its voice a low guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "And now you will join us." The cab shuddered, and the figure stepped forward, its movements fluid and unnatural. The air grew colder, and I felt an invisible force pulling me toward the darkness. My instincts screamed to run, to fight, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by the figure's gaze. Desperation took over. I reached for the panel and pressed every button, hoping to restart the elevator, to escape. The cab groaned, its mechanisms protesting, but it began to rise. The figure let out a deafening roar, its form stretching impossibly as it tried to reach me, but the doors slammed shut just in time. The elevator ascended erratically, the lights flickering wildly. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my fingers digging into the handrail. The chanting had returned, louder and angrier, but I didn't care. I focused on the panel, on the numbers lighting up one by one, counting down the seconds until I reached safety. The cab stopped abruptly at the 8th floor, and the doors opened to the familiar dim hallway. I stumbled out, my legs barely supporting me, and turned to see the elevator close behind me. The out-of-service sign swayed gently, as if mocking me. I didn't go to my apartment. Instead, I ran down the stairs and out of the building, the cool night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the block, my heart still pounding, my mind racing. But as I stood there, staring at the building, I knew the elevator wasn't done with me. The figure had seen me, marked me. The rules had been broken, and there would be consequences. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind against the windows felt like it was alive, watching, waiting. The void and the figure within it had followed me out of the elevator, not physically, but in my mind. Its voice echoed in my thoughts, a constant reminder of the rules I had broken. The next morning, I packed my things. I wasn't staying another night in that building, not with what I knew. I didn't care about the lease or the hassle of finding a new place. I just needed to leave. As I carried my bags down the stairs, I passed by the elevator. The out-of-service sign hung crookedly on the gate, as unassuming as ever. I froze, staring at it, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The gate was slightly ajar. For a brief, horrifying moment, I considered stepping inside one last time, as if confronting it would make sense of everything. But my fear won. I pulled the gate shut, forcing it to click into place, and hurried down the stairs. Outside, the sun was bright, the world warm and alive in a way the building never was. But as I walked away, I felt an undeniable pull, a weight dragging me back toward the place I was trying to leave behind. The building stood silent and unyielding, its dark windows staring out at the world like empty eyes. I moved into a new apartment across town the following week. It was nothing special. Plain walls, a small kitchen, and thankfully, no elevator. But the peace I'd hoped for didn't come. The nightmares began almost immediately. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the void's endless darkness, and the figure's piercing gaze fresh in my mind. The rules replayed themselves constantly, a mantra I couldn't escape. Worse, I started noticing things in the waking world, shadows that stretched too far, faint whispers where there should have been silence. One night, I woke to a sound that made my blood run cold, a soft ding. My eyes darted to the door of my apartment, where I swore I saw a faint glow, like the light of an elevator panel. But when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. The rules weren't confined to that building. The elevator, or whatever force controlled it, wasn't bound by walls or location. It had seen me, marked me, and it wasn't letting go. I tried to warn others. I wrote down everything I knew, detailing the rules, the figure, the void. I sent the notes to anyone who would listen. Building managers, urban legends forums, even the local news. But no one responded. No one believed me. Weeks later, I received a package in the mail. It was small and wrapped in plain brown paper. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. My heart sank as I unfolded it. Rules for the elevator. Only use the elevator between 12 a.m. and 12 a.m. Press the button for the 6th floor first, no matter where you're going. Do not speak during the ride, no matter what you hear. If anyone enters the elevator, do not look directly at them. Never ride the elevator twice in one night. At the bottom, in the same sharky handwriting as before, was a new note. The cycle continues. That night, I sat in my dark apartment, staring at the note. I didn't have an elevator in my building, but somehow I knew that didn't matter. The elevator would find me, or I'd find it, and the rules would start again. The cycle always continued.